Gentlemen, start your engines. Boogity, boogity, boogity. Let's go debating, boys. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another riveting edition of Convince Me. As always, I'm Andy Rutherford, joined by Mr. Brian Bennett, Mr. Casey Elrod. Gentlemen, how's it going?
What's going on? Are you still butthurt over last week? Sir Rob?
Last week is in the past. We don't live in the past. Bennett, how are you?
I'm doing good. How's it going?
It is going pretty well, guys. You guys continue to support us. I'm looking forward to this show. We're recording this on Monday night, but by right now, the teaser posts for this show are performing really well. I assume, looking at that, we're going to have some new audience members tonight. Welcome. We hope you stick around for a while. Just so you know, you can catch us right here on Facebook every Tuesday night, on Wednesdays, on your favorite podcasting platform. And then we're also on YouTube. Those videos are delayed a week, basically not to hurt our Facebook numbers. But you can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. Like I said, on YouTube. You can go to anchor.fm/convincemeshow. You can listen to the pod there or directly support us. But the best way to support us is just to listen to us. Watch these videos. Make sure you're listening to the podcast. Rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. It is middle of July. COVID-19 is still, unfortunately, very much a thing, but we're starting to maybe see some sports come back. And one of the first ones that's come back has been the great American tradition of NASCAR. Of course, you're watching this on Tuesday night. Tomorrow night, Wednesday night, will be the All-Star race for the first time from Bristol, Tennessee. Tickets are pretty cheap. Thought about going, but work life determines I'm not going to. But just to kind of give you a little, some people right now, judging by our Facebook posts, may not be as enthralled with NASCAR as they once were. But tonight we're looking at the glory days, and we're looking at two of the greatest drivers to ever get behind the wheel of a car. We're talking about the King, the Petty Blue 43 STP, Richard Petty, represented tonight by Mr. Bennett, and the Intimidator, and that good wrench number 3, represented by Mr. Elrod, the Intimidator, Dale Earnhardt. Gentlemen, you made your final pit stops. Are you ready for the last green flag run?
Robin's racing, baby.
Now, wait a minute. I was under the impression we were doing a debate on who had the sweetest mustache.
Well, if my guy wins that.
Because I thought Dale Earnhardt, but we're talking about the best driver.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, that changes everything. I'm going to have to go with Richard Petty. That changes everything.
Oh, Bennett just had the big one coming out of turn 3, but he'll adjust under the caution. We're talking about Dale Earnhardt versus Richard Petty tonight. And, gentlemen, to decide who goes first, here's what we're going to do. Do you have pen and paper? I didn't tell you to, but I assume you guys are prepared and ready anyway.
I'm always ready with pen and paper, this show.
So here's the tiebreaker. Closest to the number wins, even if it's over. Just closest to the number. I have a second round tiebreaker if necessary, but Richard Petty made the number 43 car famous. Same as Dale Earnhardt did for the number 3. The question tonight, since Richard Petty quit driving, as I'm sure Bennett will point out later, in 1992, and since Dale Earnhardt's untimely and unfortunate passing in 2001, I need the combined number of drivers who have driven the 43 after Richard Petty plus that have driven the 3 after Dale Earnhardt.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, let's see them, gentlemen.
13.
16.
On the nose, it's 13.
Oh,
There have been 12 drivers to drive the 43. Elrod, did you know that?
No. I did the math. One person, I think, drove the 3 and maybe
The only
One
person
person
to
to
drive
drive
the
the
number 3 has been Austin Dillon. In the 43, after Richard Petty quit racing, John Andretti, Willie Dallenbach Jr., Bobby Hamilton, Jeff Green, Christian Fittipaldi, Bobby Labonte, Reed Sorensen, AJ Allmendinger, Eric Almirola, Billy Johnson, Reagan Smith, and, of course, currently Bubba Wallace. So that
Did Dale
makes –
Jr. not drive number 3?
do what?
Did Dale Jr. not drive number 3 in Daytona in 2010? The Wrangler number 3?
Did he?
no, it was the 8. It was a color scheme, but it was the 8. I'm pretty sure.
Mm-mm.
Ooh.
Either way,
Regardless,
still would have
13th
just been
would be
one
fine.
off, but
Dale Jr.'s my guy.
hold on. Now you've got me.
Daytona 2010.
Host is wrong.
Wrangler number 3. He won.
Well, what do you know?
I'm putting it out there now. I'm putting it out there.
My wow, my source was wrong.
And that was the only time he quit driving it. After that, done.
I mean, that's a good time to quit.
Yeah,
he's
quit
perfect
then.
record driving it. But
Boom.
anyway, Elrod still would have won, so no controversy here. Mr. Elrod, will you be taking the go around, or will you be first of the line? He's taking the pass. So, Mr. Bennett, opening arguments. You are up.
How fitting to have Richard Petty first. Okay.
I know there's just between me and you tonight, so that's fitting if there's only 2 people. So, yeah.
What?
Not a lot of competition.
You want to get into that right now or save?
I don't know if that's an argument you want to make, Elrod, but continue.
No.
Okay, yeah. Well, when I first started researching this, before I even started looking into the stats and the numbers, I remember a analogy that I'd ran across a couple of years ago, and I'd shared it with somebody. I don't know if I shared it with you, Rudd, or somebody else. But the analogy that the person was trying to get across said that Richard Petty is like the Michael Jordan of NASCAR, only he's more dominant than MJ was. And we'll see tonight if that analogy is really true. But what we do know is statistically, he is the most accomplished driver in the history of the sport. He's one of the most recognizable figures. He's got the sunglasses, he's got the hat, he's got the iconic number 43. His racing career spanned 5 decades. And even today in 2020, he still remains active, with the Richard Petty Motorsports. He's also one of the most well-respected figures in motorsports. And I'll save all the good stuff for later. Tonight, Mr. Rutt, I will convince you that Richard Petty, a.k.a. the King, is the better driver.
All right. Mr. Elrod, your opening argument for Mr. Earnhardt.
Ooh, well, what can I say about Dale Sr.? The Intimidator, the Man in Black, Mr. Restrictor Plate, which
There it is.
you see, we'll talk more about that tonight. He was not a one-trick pony, unlike his son. They're all great names to describe this man. Fierce competitor. I compare Dale Sr. to one of my idols, Tiger Woods, in that they were willing to do whatever it took to win. They were willing to win at all costs. They took no prisoners. Some of the great sports quotes that we have comes from Dale Sr. You ever heard of the quote, "Second place is just the first loser"? It's Dale Sr. My favorite quote.
Never mind. I thought that was somebody else.
You win
I thought that was
some.
Will Ferrell.
Talladega. You win some, you lose some, and you wreck some. Another great Dale Senior quote. One of my other favorite Dale Senior quotes was after the 99 race at the night race at Bristol, where he put Terry Labonte in the wall on the final lap, where he said, it was obvious he crashed Labonte, but he said, I just wanted to rattle his cage a little bit. It was clear that he wanted to wreck Labonte. We've talked a lot about iconic matchups on this show, right? We talked about King George versus Garth, Michael Jackson versus Elvis, Brady versus Manning. All of these were generational, but more so this debate tonight is more of a generational debate. If you were, I would say, below 50, I think 80% of people is going with Earnhardt. If you're in that age group where you're 55, or especially the 70 and over crew that were 18-year-olds in the 60s, they're going to go with Richard Petty. But tonight, I will convince you, right, that the level of competition, this inflated win total that Richard Petty has, when you compare it with Dale Sr., the car, we're going to talk a lot about the cars that these men were driving tonight, or at least I am. And we're going to talk about the influence on the sport as a whole. Dale Sr., in terms of NASCAR, has had a much bigger effect on safety and everything else with NASCAR than Richard Petty had. We'll talk more about that later. And I just want to tell you this, Bennett, you better watch your mirror, because you're going to be like Mr. Labonte in 1999 in Bristol, Thunder Valley. You're going to be going into the wall, because you know what, Bennett? Rubbin's racing, baby. Rubbin's racing.
You got to catch me first, man.
All right, gentlemen. Both these guys definitely iconic, and a lot of similarities between the two. They're both North Carolina boys. Both of them came from both their fathers were racers. But Elrod, tell me a little bit about the beginnings of Dale Earnhardt and him getting in to the NASCAR scene.
Yeah, so both these men had accomplished fathers, as you just said. A lot of people don't know this, but Petty and Earnhardt, their fathers are both in. There was a thing that came out in '98 about who were the 50 greatest NASCAR drivers of all time. Both Earnhardt's dad, Ralph, and Lee Petty are in that group, along with their sons. Dale Sr., his dad, Ralph, was a legend in North Carolina on the short track circuit. Racing in North Carolina back in the 60s and 70s was a lot like professional wrestling was in the early 60s and 70s, was regional. There was not a centralized body. There's NASCAR, but most people, they couldn't afford to go around the country back then and race at these different tracks. So it was more of a regional type of thing. Well, Dale's father was a legend in North Carolina. The problem was Dale wanted to, it was a hard thing to follow in the shoes of Ralph. He had a great admiration for his father. His father actually dropped out of school in the 6th grade to focus on racing. He did not want that for his son, Dale Sr. But he dropped out when he was 16. And Ralph, his father, died of a heart attack at age 45. And that left a void with Dale that he didn't really prove anything to his father during his lifetime. So Earnhardt was married 3 times. His second wife produced a man by the name of Dale Jr. Kerry came from his first wife. I know you'd like that, Bennett. He began, usually in this modern age of NASCAR, you go up through the Truck Series. You go up through the Busch Series. There's a progression. Well, back in 70, I believe it was 75, Earnhardt was an accomplished driver himself in North Carolina. He supplemented his ability to go around and race by working in a cotton mill, like his dad did. He worked in a cotton mill. He worked in an auto body repair shop there in North Carolina. But he got his first big start in 75 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. He finished 22nd, just one spot ahead of his his soon-to-be car owner, Richard Childress. The thing about Dale Sr. was sponsors knew that this guy had immense talent. They knew that he had a championship pedigree from his father. But the problem that the sponsors had was this guy's wrecking all over freaking cars. It's costing them a boatload of money to repair these vehicles. After every race, even though he won, the front end is tore off the car. It's a mess. Well, in '79, a guy by the name of Roy Osterland was a guy that made a fortune in rental units in California. Decides he wants a racing team. One of the first people he hires is Dale Sr., and he won the Rookie of the Year that year, his very first year in NASCAR. He had 4 poles. He won Bristol, which Bristol is going to become a theme tonight. He's a restrictor plate legend, but some of his more famous wins that we'll talk about tonight came at Bristol Motor Speedway, which is not a restrictor plate race, as we know. The following year with this team, he wins the championship in his second year. He is the only person to ever win the Rookie of the Year and then go on to win the championship in the next season. Now, I don't know how far you want me to go into necessarily subsequent years, but that's the gist of how he got his start in NASCAR. Roy Osterland was losing his butt in terms of amount of money he was paying out for these different cars. He was not a NASCAR guy, so he folds up and sells the team mid-season. Earnhardt goes to Bud Moore Engineering. He kind of struggles for those 2 years because they were thrown into a situation where they were basically thrown out of their garage. And then he strikes up a relationship with Richard Childress. And his run with Richard Childress Racing is arguably the best of all time. When you think of owner-driver, Earnhardt, Childress comes to mind, and also Hendrick and Gordon. That's the 2 people. When you think of owner-driver relationships, that's the 2. And the rest is history. We'll talk more about the accolades tonight, but that's the gist of how Earnhardt got into NASCAR.
There's only one thing I want to tear apart about what you just said. Most drivers win Rookie of the Year in their first year. Just wanted to point that out.
Not all of them win Rookie of the Year, though.
No, but every Rookie of the Year has won it in their first
year. Yeah, but he won the championship. He's the only person to win Rookie of the Year championship the year after that.
Mr. Bennett, let's go back a little bit further in time. Tell us how one Richard Petty, kind of his beginnings in getting into NASCAR.
Well, Mr. Richard Lee Petty was born July 2nd, 1937. So, happy belated birthday, Richard Petty.
Absolutely.
He was born in Randleman, North Carolina. Like you said, both these guys are from North Carolina. And racing is literally in his DNA. I know y'all talked about this a little bit, but he is the son of Lee Petty, huge legend. He won 3 Grand National Championships in the 50s, and his 54 wins stood as an all-time record until they were broken. Do you know who broke that record? Richard Petty. And even though Richard was pretty much bitten by the racing bug from a very early age, it's evident because he was his father's pit crew chief at the age of 12. It's crazy. His dad would not let him race until he was a legal adult. So soon as he turned 21, it was literally days after he turned 21, he entered in his first race, and he finished 6th. And a few races later, Richard Petty thought he had his very first win. He was in the lead. The checker flag was waved, and he was on his way to the victory lane. Well, this driver protests and wins and says that the checkered flag was waved on the wrong lap. Do you know who made that protest? His dad, Lee Petty. So that kind of shows a relationship there. But Richard didn't mind. He said that he wanted to do it on his own. He didn't want to just, coattail off of his dad. And this was in 1959, by the way. And guess what? Rookie of the Year, 1959. 9 top 10 finishes and 6 top 5 finishes. Not too bad. And the year later, 1960, he finished second in the Grand National points. So just about won it in 60. Flash forward a little bit to 1962, because all the spotlight was on his dad. All of the attention was put on his dad. His dad always had all the good cars. So Richard was kind of taking a backseat, if you will, to his dad. But that all changed in 1962 when his dad was pretty much knocked out of racing after a near fatal crash. And that was really Richard's time to step up and shine and make a name for himself. And I would say that he would not disappoint. We'll have more on that a little bit later.
All right. Well, y'all have talked about it. I talked about the awards. Of course, you both alluded to wins already. Let's get into it. As everyone knows, I'm sure if you have any interest in NASCAR watching this show, there are 3 men in the history of NASCAR that have 7 championships, and 2 of them we are discussing tonight. Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, and of course currently racing, who knows, could get his 8th. The way NASCAR point systems work now, who knows? But Jimmy Johnson is also in that conversation. But obviously these 2 guys, Earnhardt and Petty, were winners. And Bennett, you mentioned earlier that Richard Petty was one of the most accomplished racers to ever get behind the wheel. So let's look at their championships and their accomplishments. And Bennett, tell me about Richard Petty.
Well, this is really where Richard Petty completely separates himself from every other driver there's ever been. The man raced for 35 years, and it spanned over 5 decades. That's crazy. He was the first driver to win those 7 championships like you talked about. He was named the most popular driver 6 times by NASCAR and 9 times by the fans, which shows that, yeah, he was winning, but he was also loved by NASCAR and the fans both. And he really stands alone when it comes to stock car history. Get this. Okay. He has a record 127 pole positions. He has 27 victories in 1 season, and 10 of those were consecutive. He had 513 consecutive starts, which I think is a testament to his longevity to go out there and race. He did that from 71 until 89. He has 1,185 total starts. That's also a record that I don't think will ever be broken. He has 200 wins. That'll never be broken.
No.
Over 700 top 10s. That'll never be broken. 356, I think, top 5s. That'll never be broken. He's the first stock car driver to exceed 1 million in earnings, which kind of sounds funny now because you know how much the purses are now, but still, it's a fun fact. He was the first. He won Daytona 500 7 times. Should have had an 8th, but I'll talk about that later. He was the 59 Rookie of the Year. He was in the inaugural Hall of Fame class. And he also received the Medal of Freedom by President George Bush in 1992. He was the first motorsport athlete to do this. So I'm a little bit too young, so I know y'all are a little bit too young. So I don't really remember Richard Petty actually driving. So I didn't really get to witness history. But some of the people that are watching, some people that are listening, if you ever got to see him, you witnessed history and witnessed records that will never, ever be broken because the man is the king and he is NASCAR royalty.
Bennett, one follow-up right there. You said he won the Rookie of the Year in 59. Was that his first year?
I think it was his 5th.
Y'all are so funny. So funny.
Elrod, tell me about Dale's championships and accomplishments.
Well, we talked about the Rookie of the Year that he won in 79. His first championship came the year after that in 80. He won 7 championships total, including that 80 victory. There was an interview with him on the David Letterman show. After his championship season, I believe it was in 90. So this would have been, in 90. And David Letterman asked him, what do you want to accomplish? By this time he had won 5 championships, I believe. He says, well, what do you want to do? He says, I want to tie Richard Petty. I want 7. I want 7 or more. He wasn't really interested in the wins. He won 76 times. Now, the difference is, we'll talk more about this later, he's doing this in fields of 35 cars or more during this time. He's doing this in a season where there's 30 or 31 races a year. During the Richard Petty years, Richard Petty is racing fields of 20 cars average, and he's racing 60 times a year. Of course he's going to have 200 wins. We'll talk more about that later. Surprisingly, Earnhardt says his best victory that he had in his career was not at Daytona. It was not Talladega. He said his best win that he had was at the Brickyard. Brickyard was a newer track to the NASCAR field in the 90s. It was exclusively an open wheel track. And he said that winning there was his best win. He won the most popular driver in 2001 after he died. He raced 600. He was in 676 races over 27 years. He raced in 5 decades. The one stat that really stuck out at me, right? He has 428 top 10s in 676 races. That's a 63% rate of being in the top 10 in each of these races, which is remarkable. One thing, in 2000, he finished second in points. That was the year before he died. 2001, he was one of the favorites to win the championship. He had a great car at Daytona. He was one of the Las Vegas betting odds to win the championship in 2001. We'll talk more about his unfortunate death later on, but he was on track. He was nowhere near retirement. He had a rough 99 year. There's a lot of talk about is Dale Sr., is he ready to pass the torch to his son? But he was on the uptick, as that run at Daytona showed in 2001. He was on the uptick. So who knows how many more wins he could have had if he hadn't passed away in February 2001. But the 7 championships speak for themselves, this insane rate of being in the top 10. And we'll talk more about the specifics later, but just a remarkable career for this man.
All right. So both obviously extremely accomplished, or else we wouldn't be having the show with these two gentlemen. But as has been alluded to, Dale Earnhardt's first full year, 1979, his first year when he won Rookie of the Year. That was 1979. Richard Petty stopped racing in 1992. Didn't retire. Bennett so eloquently pointed out to me before we started rolling here tonight, and I'm sure he'll bring up at some point in a little bit. But there's over a decade there. Matter of fact, the entire 80s, they're both on the circuit at the same time. Elrod, tell me about Dale's run in the 80s and in that time when he is racing head-to-head with Richard Petty.
Yeah, so we always talk about, well, what would happen if Michael Jordan or LeBron James played in the same time period? We always like to fantasize, what if Tiger played with Jack back in their primes? Well, we actually saw this play out with Dale Sr. and Richard Petty. They raced against each other more than 400 times between 75 and 92. Earnhardt finished better than him in 274 of the 415 races. Of those races, Earnhardt won 52 times and Petty just won 15 times. Petty had a real rough stretch in the late 80s. He had change in ownership. There's always been turmoil within Petty Enterprises after Lee Petty died in terms of what is the company going to be like after Richard Petty? And they never really quite figured that out. All of Earnhardt's race wins came in the modern age of NASCAR. And what I mean by that is there's fewer races per year. I mean, this was ridiculous. Back in the 50s and 60s, I don't see how they did this, but they were racing 3 times a week in the Grand National Series, or we know as the Winston Cup Series. It's ridiculous. Earnhardt, his average season was 30 to 31 races. It fluctuated. Earnhardt he put these numbers up in fewer races. He never raced more than 34 times a season. There was a couple times where Richard Petty was out 62 times in a season. For example, in 64, in Petty's first title year, there were 62 races that paid points. He raced in 61 of them. He won 9. This is how crazy – we won't get into this tonight, but the point system in NASCAR has always been messed up. NASCAR's never been able to figure out a point system that makes sense. Ned Jarrett, Dale's father, won 15 times in 1964. How many points do you think he lost to Richard Petty by?
Probably a lot.
5,000 points. And he won 14 times. Earnhardt had a shorter season, and he still has comparable numbers. He still has the same number of championships as Petty. He doesn't have the sheer number as Petty, but if you put Dale Earnhardt in, and we'll talk more about the car later on, but if you put him in the 60s when Richard Petty was churning out 3 wins a week, and sometimes his number is going to be close to 200, if not more. So in terms of the actual head-to-head, Dale Earnhardt had him in the 80s, and he had him in the late. That 79 year, he had a win. But if you look at the 80s, which is the primary time period between these two, Earnhardt had his number.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with you on the fact that when we talked about this earlier today, NASCAR's point system has always sucked. They've changed it, and it's sucked in a different way. But pretty much since Richard Petty started driving until the race on July 12th, 2020, which was yesterday, they still haven't got a point system that seems like it makes sense. But Mr. Bennett, tell me about Richard Petty, his side of things in those head-to-head races. Mr. Elrod's just left, apparently.
He's intimidated.
I'm intimidated.
I'll let him sit down for this. I want him to hear this. We'll wait. There he is.
I know.
Right.
He's doing a
Hit me.
show here.
Hit me.
All right. I'm just going to touch on a few of the things that you mentioned before I get into my spiel. Yes, there was more races back then. That's just the way it was. He didn't make the rules, but he still got that checkered flag. And we talked about how he was driving against less drivers. He was, especially there in the 60s. Some of the guys that he was driving against, they weren't really good. You had Junior Johnson, Ned Jarrett, David Pearson, Cale Yarborough, Cotton Owens, and Bobby Allison. All those guys are Hall of Famers. This is also during the era where the driver did more than get behind the wheel and run laps. Richard Petty in that time, he was the driver, he was the mechanic, and he was the GM, all three. And I know we talked about how he accumulated a lot of wins when they were racing, 60 times in a season. But if you look, that was only during the 60s. In the early 70s, that's what's considered the modern era. That's when they bumped down to 28 to 30 races. Petty won 58 races, 5 championships, and 3 Daytonas from 1971 to 1975. Earnhardt won 76 races, 7 championships, and only 1 Daytona in his entire career. So, but when you talk about head-to-head, you're talking about Richard Petty, whose dominant years were way behind him whenever Mr. Earnhardt come onto the scene in 79. I think Richard Petty was like 41 or something by that time. And it's really kind of hard to pit these two head to head because you've got one guy who's up and coming, he's fresh, and then you've got another guy who's on the more of the twilight end of his career. So if you look at the finishes, yeah, Dale won 52 of the races and Petty won 15. during those some 400 and something races that they had. So Dale wins more in this era, but he is still no Richard Petty. And I have a little example to kind of help get my point across and hopefully get my first rut point here. Here's my example. Rut, who is your favorite baseball player?
That'd be old Mike Piazza.
Oh, Mike Piazza. Mike Piazza's last year was 2007. There was another guy, played for the Braves in the mid-2000s. He was their catcher. Anybody know his name?
I know it. I just don't want to say it.
All right.
No.
2005, rookie year.
Oh, Brian McCann.
There you go. Good job. Okay, Brian McCann's first year, 2005. Of Brian McCann and Mike Piazza, who would you say is the better catcher?
Not even close.
This
Not
is
even
weird
close.
off.
No. Hang on with me here. Hang on with me. Piazza's final 3 years was 2005, 2006, 2007. Brian McCann's first 3 years, 2005, 2006, 2007. So let's look at the numbers here. In those 3 years, Piazza had 298 hits, 49 home runs, and a combined 269 batting average. Brian McCann, 333 hits, 47 home runs, and a combined 293 average. So when you look at the stats on the paper here, Brian McCann is the better catcher during this time frame.
Wow.
So that should make him the better player, right?
Blasphemy.
That's a cheap point right there. That's a cheap point. Trying to bring up Mike Piazza.
I know we're comparing baseball to NASCAR here, but hopefully gets my point across that, yeah, technically during that era, Dale has the better stats. And looking at the stats, he's the better driver, but Richard Petty is the better racer.
Rut point to Bennett.
That's a bunch of bull.
Well, if you play your cards right, you can get rut points too. Just keep that in mind. You got to play to your
Suck
odds.
up to the Mets. Suck up to the Mets. Bring the Mets somehow into a NASCAR argument and you get a rut point. Okay.
I should get a point for bringing the Mets up.
Padres and the A's in those years. He was. No, he brought up terrible memories. Now I'm depressed. Moving
take
on.
the point away.
That was definitely the A's and the Padres were definitely his worst of times. The Mets and the Dodgers were his best of times. It just depended on what team he was on. Much like different tracks that the NASCAR drivers drive on. Some of them have ones that they're really good at. Some of them have ones that they don't have a lot of luck. So Bennett, tell me about Richard Petty's best and his worst tracks.
Well, Richard Petty's best and worst tracks. I'm going to start with the worst first, that round. His worst, I would say, was Talladega. He raced there 46 times, and he only had 2 wins. He had 11 top 5s and 18 top 10s, but that's really low for Richard Petty standards. I'd say also a lot of that too was a mental thing for him, because Talladega was the location where he probably had the worst day of his entire career. It was May 4th, 1975. A member of his pit crew, Mr. Randy Owens, is only 19 or 20 years old. Member of his pit crew, he died in a freak accident. It was just a freak, horrible accident. And I think something like that is something that you never really get over, and it kind of sticks with you. So I think he had a lot of trouble at Talladega, especially after that. Okay, now on to the best. His best by far, I'm going to say, is Daytona. He dominated Daytona. He had 10 wins there at Daytona, including 7 Daytona 500 wins. He almost had an 8th win in 1976, but on the very final lap, you've got you've got Dale here, and you've got, I think it was David Pearson. They are neck and neck, and Richard Petty kind of cuts in front of him to take the lead. But when he did, he kind of came over on him a little bit too quick and kind of nicked him, and both of them spun out. And they both wreck, and they spin out, and they're literally like 100 feet from the finish line. Both of them are spun out. Richard Petty's sitting there in the grass. He's trying to get his car started back. He couldn't. Pearson gets his started back, goes across the finish line. And you actually see members of Richard Petty's pit crew come out and push him across the finish line. And, I mean, it's crazy. It's like something you'd see out of a movie. If he could have got his car started, he would have had that eighth one. It's one of the most, like, iconic finishes at Daytona, probably one of the more iconic finishes in the history of NASCAR. But after that, he had 28 top fives at Daytona. He had 37 top tens. He was the first person to win the Daytona 500 twice. He won it in 64, then he won it in 67. He was also the first driver to win it back-to-back. He won it in 71 and 72. So when it comes to Daytona, nobody has the accolades that Mr. Richard Petty does.
Absolutely. Fun fact, which I'm sure you know, very first winner at Daytona, the very first Daytona 500, won Lee Petty. And also, last October, and I listened to it recently, Richard Petty on Dale Jr.'s podcast says that he pretty much goes to the racetrack every week still today, or at least up until last year before COVID. Goes to nearly every track as the owner except Talladega. He does not go to Talladega anymore. He refuses to go there. And Dale Jr. asked him why on the podcast, and he said, I just got too many bad memories. So even to this day, he still hates Talladega and refuses to go. So, Elrod, tell me about Mr. Earnhardt's best and worst tracks.
All right. Well, I will be like Bennett. I will start with the worst. What do you think the worst one is, Rod, for Dale Sr.?
Tracks, I don't know.
Tracks in general.
Can I answer?
Tracks in general, I don't know because
What do you think it is?
my initial instinct would be Daytona just because it took him forever to win 500. But he had some other good wins there other than 500. So tell me what it is, Mr. Elrod.
It is road courses. Road courses, in terms of Sonoma and Watkins Glen, were kind of a newer idea, and I think it was the late 80s. He ran 49 road courses. He actually has a win at Sonoma. His average finish, though, is not bad. It's 10.3. The reason why the finish is comparable to his restrictor plate races, it's actually better than the restrictor plate races. You don't really crash out at a road course. When you crash out at Daytona early in the race, you're 40th or 42nd. You don't really crash out at a road course, and that's the reason why his road course stats are a little bit better in terms of the average finish. He had 21 top fives, but Watkins Glen is probably his worst track. He never won there, but he did win at Sonoma. He did not – road course is a specialty, and it was a newer thing when he later on in his career, he never really liked it. But let's talk about the best tracks. His best track by far is Richard Petty's worst. It's Talladega. He ran 44 times. He won 10 times in those starts. 23 top fives, 27 top tens. He's the most accomplished driver in the history of Talladega. His second track, Darlington, 44 starts, 9 wins, 19 top fives, 24 top tens. He's second behind David Pearson in wins. Bristol, some people will look at his stats and say, oh, he's a restrictor plate. He's called Mr. Restrictor Plate. He's a one-trick pony, but he's not. Bristol short track, 43 starts, 9 wins. He's second. Who do you think has the most Bristol wins, right?
I don't know.
DW. Darrell Waltrip has 12 wins at Bristol.
That was
Mr.
my
Bristol
guess.
himself.
I figured I was wrong.
He was accomplished in Atlanta. He had 46 starts in Atlanta, won 9 times. He has won more starts in Atlanta than anyone else. I wish they would bring this track back just because I remember them racing Rockingham. Rockingham hasn't been on the NASCAR schedule since 2004. He has that, Charlotte, Martinsville, Richmond. He has 5 wins or more. But let's talk about Daytona for a minute. Daytona might be he didn't have the 500 wins. He had one in 98. Winning the Daytona 500 for Dale Sr. was this elusive temptress. He always had something happen in the 500 that was just out of this world. I'll give you one example. In 92, he had the best car all week at Daytona. He won the Gatorade Duel by a lot. He was on the pole. On the very first lap, he's racing Davey Allison on the backstretch out of turn 1. When he gets to the backstretch, a seagull hits his car, and it causes extensive damage to the car that puts him back in the pack that whole day. I'm about to get me a rut point here. One of the more successful drivers in the history of Daytona is Tony Stewart. It's Smoke. But him and Dale Sr. always had something go wrong or something happen to them at Daytona that prevented them from winning. If you look at Daytona as a whole, if you bring in the dual races, the shootout, I don't know if they call it the shootout anymore. If you bring in the July 4th race, in 46 Cup starts, he had 3 wins, 22 top 5s, and this is the kicker. He had 34 top 10s in his career at Daytona. He won his qualifying race 12 times. And he won from 1990 to 1999, he won his qualifying race every single year at Daytona. But he had 1 win to show for it. He's basically the Atlanta Braves when it came to the 90s. When it came to the Daytona 500, he was the Atlanta Braves. And some more things that happened. He's ran out of gas on the last lap. One thing that you look at when you look at Dale Sr. stats, he always in his career had the worst gas mileage of any driver just because of the way he drove. His crew chiefs always had a terrible time figuring out the gas mileage with him because of the way he drove. He had flat tires at the finish line. As he's going across, people have won ahead of him, and they've won the race. Finally, in 98, he won the Daytona 500. In 95, I'll leave it with this. In 95, he had one of the best cars that year, too. And he did not win. And after the race, they asked him, well, Dale, tell us about the race. He said, well, I ain't won the Daytona 500, and I ain't been to Disney World. So he said that he would only go to Disney World if he won the race. So he finally got to go to Disney World in 98. He's one of the more accomplished drivers in the history of that track. But like I said, he's like Tony Stewart, and it was finding victory lane was very elusive for him at that track. But it was one of his most successful tracks overall.
2007 Daytona 500. Yours truly in the stands. Tony Stewart leads something like 80 out of the first 100-something laps. And freaking Kurt Busch gets inside of him on turn 4, and they both hit the wall. And Smoke did not return to the race. And there are people in the grandstands on the backstretch, which are no longer there at Daytona, that heard things coming out of my mouth that I would ever be ashamed to repeat ever again. But yes, Daytona was a heartbreaker for Smoke, and it was a heartbreaker for Dale for a long time. Because Smoke also, like you said, July races, qualifying races, Busch Series races, he owned Daytona. And I hate Kurt Busch to this day. But anyway, speaking of hating Kurt Busch, drivers in NASCAR often have strong opinions of other drivers in NASCAR. A lot of them are fishing buddies. A lot of them are golfing buddies. A lot of them really want to punch each other in the pits. There's a certain perception that other drivers have that is very public of other drivers, maybe more in NASCAR than any other sport. So, Elrod, tell me about the perception of Dale Earnhardt, not to his fans or the crowd or the experts, but to the other drivers that he competed against.
I would say the perception was he was feared as a driver, sometimes hated, more often than not always hated by his competition on the track, but he was always respected. And if you look at quotes from drivers in recent years about Dale Sr., and even at the time, on the Dale Jr. podcast, Richard Petty talked about Dale Sr. this way. He said, in terms of Dale Sr., if you get in his way, you better watch out because he takes no prisoners. And Petty tells a story about how in 79, in the rookie season for Dale Sr., they're at Martinsville on the very first lap. And they got the flag to go, the green flag to go. They're entering turn one. Dale Sr. already crashes out, and his car lands on Richard Petty in the infield. And he said, he went up to Dale Sr. and he said, "Boy, don't let that happen again." He says, "I gave him one of those finger deals, and that's the first time I remember meeting Dale Earnhardt, was giving him the finger in the Martinsville grass." One more rival that he had in his career was Darrell Waltrip. They had a very strained relationship in the late 80s, early 90s. But Waltrip summed him up like this. He said he was a character. I mean, he was a tough customer. He made sure that he lived up to it. He was all about risk reward. He would take any risk to get that reward. You could go out on the track to practice, just some simple thing like to practice. He wanted to win practice. He was a man that thought all about winning races, and you better not get in his way because, as he would put it, he would rattle your cage. You're going too slow, you better move over. A lot of people wonder how he got the name the Intimidator. Well, he got it from an incident with Bill Elliott. Bill Elliott is one of the nicest people to ever race in NASCAR. Awesome Bill from Dawsonville. Bill Elliott has never said a foul word about anybody, to my knowledge, but he did about Dale Earnhardt, because in the All-Star race in Charlotte, I believe this was late 80s, early 90s, this race is not for points. It's a money grab. Well, toward the end of the race, this is where the famous pass in the grass happened, where Dale is in the lead. Bill Elliott goes to pass. Bill Elliott comes to the white line. Dale Sr. goes down into the grass and stops him and crashes Bill Elliott out in the race. After the race, Bill Elliott says, "You know what, guys? I'm really mad right now. I'm mad at that man." That's about the meanest thing Bill Elliott has ever said about another human being. Rusty Wallace was another nice guy. But even in 95, after Bristol, there is an emergence of a driver in the 90s. You may have heard of him, called Jeff Gordon. Jeff Gordon was, people have, like, they love God, they love Satan. You love Dale Sr. or you love Jeff Gordon. That's the way Dale Sr.'s people saw Jeff Gordon in the mid-90s. So the story goes that Dale Sr. went to Rusty Wallace before the race and said, "We're going to teach this California man a lesson. We're going to take him out at Bristol at the night race in Thunder Valley." Rusty Wallace is all on board. He doesn't like Jeff Gordon either. He says, "Let's do it." The problem is Dale Sr. takes out Rusty Wallace instead of Jeff Gordon. After the race, Rusty Wallace tries to get the attention. He gets a water bottle from his son, and he tries to get Dale's attention. He can't get it. So he takes a water bottle and throws it at his face, and they fought in the pits there in Bristol. And even his own son, Dale Jr., in 99, this would have been the year before Dale Jr. was full-time in NASCAR. They went over to Japan for a charity race. And in his podcast, Dale Jr. talks about how they were bumping each other on the track. He didn't wreck his dad, but he finished ahead of his dad. After the race, Dale Jr. says that his daddy comes up to him with a shoe and throws it in his face and said, "Don't ever do that again." So this kind of set the tone, even to his own son, that he had this mentality that I'm going to win. It doesn't matter if you try to stop me. It doesn't matter who you are. I am going to win at all costs. So that is what other people have thought. He was respected, he was feared, but more often than not, he was hated on the track. But he later cultivated relationships with people like Darrell Waltrip. After he even gave Darrell Waltrip a job, he gave him a car in the late '90s. So he had these frosty relationships, but later on in his career, he kind of mended the fences with a lot of these people because they understood he just wanted to win.
Bennett, how did the other drivers perceive and think of Richard Petty?
This is going to be relatively short because there's not a whole lot of negativity around Richard Petty. It's been pretty much mostly positive. He's an extremely well-liked and respected guy in the motorsport world. I don't know of really anybody that could have something negative to say about Richard Petty except maybe possibly Elrod tonight. Maybe. We'll see. He was just a classy guy. There's a quote from a gentleman that said, "I'm a big fan of Richard Petty. If I was to win 7, it wouldn't matter because he's still the king. He's way up there on the throne by himself. But it does put us in an elite class right there to be with the king." That was Dale Earnhardt after his 4th Cup championship. Now, Richard Petty, he had, which I guess you could consider some rivalries. Cale Yarborough, Bobby Allison, David Pearson. But the rivalries then weren't like, they were more so in the 90s. They respected each other. They could be fierce competitors, but they definitely respected each other's craft. Bobby Allison said Richard Petty was the toughest competitor at the time, and he was the top guy for all those years. So it shows, that they real fierce competitors, but they respected him. If anything, if I had to put a knock on Richard Petty, it would be that he's been too gracious to his fans over the years. And it really shows up the other drivers. Richard Petty's probably signed more autographs than probably anybody ever in the history of mankind. Richard Petty, not to get off course here, but I've got to tell this. Of all the things that Richard Petty has signed over the years, the craziest thing that Richard Petty has signed was a duck. You heard me right, a duck.
He wins.
A real, live, living, breathing duck. If the individual who got the duck autographed is watching this, or if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast available every Wednesday, please message us with the full story because I want to know more about this autographed duck.
Yes. If you're watching or listening, we will bring you on this show immediately because I want to hear this.
I need to know more. I have so many questions. Anywho, talking about autographs, Ned Jarrett said once, Richard Petty has to own the world record for autographs signed. And my boy Dale Jr. once, he said that he set the bar entirely too high for the rest of us, didn't he? And he said this because Richard Petty was actually holding up the little golf cart road there for the drivers on race day. It was causing people to be late because he was just sitting there signing autograph after autograph after autograph. And there's been times where he stayed late many hours signing autographs. So, he's a good dude. He's well respected and, just all around classy guy.
Gotcha. My question is, I'm going back to the duck. Like, when the duck dies, do you keep the duck because it's autographed? Do you get the duck taxidermied, or does, like, if the duck's around water, does it eventually rub off?
That's the thing. Do you sign it on the beak where it has a better chance of staying?
Was it like a Sharpie or a paint pen, or what are we talking? I need details.
Please let us know if you're watching this.
If anybody knows this, even if it's not you, if you know the story of this signed duck, I am officially intrigued.
For those that had Brian McCann, Mike Piazza, and a duck in your bingo for this show tonight, collect your prize.
We're just getting started. I got some more goodies.
Oh, me. Well, speaking of, you know how you know you're famous when you get asked to sign a duck. But here's the thing: NASCAR has always had kind of a niche audience. But to the general public probably doesn't know that many drivers. Your general public doesn't know who Buckshot Jones or Wood Button is. But everybody knows Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt. And a lot of times when you're that big a star, it's because you were introduced, or because you're that big of a star, a lot of times there are things outside of NASCAR. There are movies and TV shows and commercials and endorsements, putting yourself out there. So to maybe somebody who doesn't keep up with NASCAR, what might they know Richard Petty from in it?
Well, Richard Petty has been a really busy man, especially since he quit driving NASCAR. He's, he's got the Richard Petty Motorsports. Talked about commercials some. Some of the commercials that he's in, kind of the spokesman he's for: Liberty Medical, Cheerios, Nicorette, and probably the one that everybody's seen this commercial. He is for the Goodies headache powder.
Yep.
Everybody's seen Richard Petty with the Goodies headache powder. I don't care who you are. 1995, he joined CBS as a color commentator. 2011, he was featured on a show that I'm not too familiar with called Modern Hot Rods. And it showcased his garage. And speaking of his garage, even now, currently in his garage, they will build like custom built cars for the general public. And many of these are like one of a kind custom build pieces. It's pretty neat. He's appeared in some movies too, in one way, shape, form, or another. He appeared as himself in the movie Swing Vote, along with his number 43 car. He appeared with Tom Cruise in the film Days of Thunder. Mm. He appeared with Burt Reynolds in the film Stroker Ace. Can you imagine a film with Burt Reynolds and Richard Petty? Do you know how many sunglasses and cowboy hats are probably in that movie? A little fun fact, too, about Burt Reynolds. Richard Petty was the inspiration for the character Bandit for Smokey and the Bandit. A little fun fact there. He appeared as himself in the movie called 43, very original name, and also a movie called Speed Zone. He is in the opening credits of Elvis's movie Speedway. NASCAR has a documentary on him that's called Petty Blue. And the big one, this is the big one. All those other movies don't matter. This is what matters. Petty voiced Strip Weathers, a.k.a. the King, in the Disney Pixar smash hit Cars. His car is that Roadrunner Superbird. It's got the Petty blue color on it and the number 43. That Roadrunner Superbird is one of my favorite cars. And even in Cars 3, I think the whole family is in Cars 3. You know, him and his wife, and I think Kyle Petty is also in that. This movie, Cars, is probably my favorite Disney Pixar movie. And for the sheer fact that Richard Petty voiced in cars, that should be an automatic win for at least this category, if not the entire show.
Mm.
The best part
Mm.
about the movie Cars, the reason I'm laughing at just your mention, and I don't know why, and this has absolutely nothing to do with the show. It just, when I think of the movie Cars, I think about it. When they're talking about, I think they're talking about Richard Petty's character. They said he won 3 piston cups, and Mater says he did what in the cup?
Funniest part. Funniest part.
I'm proud. All right. Tell us about. Sorry.
All right, dude, you're up.
Tell us about Dale Earnhardt's image, about some extracurricular things he was involved in. There's a big opportunity for a rut point here.
There might be.
Don't miss it.
Well, he was in a lot less films and shows as Mr. Petty, but there's a but to this. He was in the Academy Award winning movie. Won Golden Globes, not really, but still, he was in Basketball in 1998. Is that my rut point?
Rut point.
Put on the board. Great, not my favorite movie, but he was in the movie after he just captured his first Daytona 500 win. There's a scene where they're needing a taxi cab. They get in and they realize it's Dale Earnhardt, and then he puts on his helmet and they're flying down the street. That's the only movie that he was ever in. Was that one movie? He had a couple. A very good movie to be in. Yeah. Academy Award winning movie. He was in a couple of commercials. He lived a very private life outside the track. That's how he wanted it. He was an avid hunter, outdoorsman. So he signed a sponsorship with Rural Tree. He's quoted as saying that 2 of his favorite things to do is one being behind a steering wheel, and the other is having his Remington rifle with him. He was also endorsed by Coca-Cola. That's about it. As to be as successful as Earnhardt was off the track, he was very awkward in interviews. He didn't like to give interviews. He was very off to himself. He wanted to be with his kids. He was going on his 3rd marriage. So he really he wanted to devote the time to the track, but he wanted to go home. There is a film made in 2004. It's got Barry Pepper as Dale Earnhardt. It's made by ESPN. It's a very good movie called 3. And what it does, it chronicles his life from Kannapolis up to the Daytona 500, which he died in 2001. But it was an unauthorized movie. There's actually some lawsuits over this movie by his 3rd wife. There's some things in the movie that are not true. A lot of the facts were distorted, but it was still a good movie. And it won its Screen Actors Guild Award. But outside of that, he did not have the same, I wouldn't say popularity, but he didn't have the same want to do the movies, the commercials, the sponsorships. He just wanted, as he said it, to prove his worth on the track. So he didn't do a lot of the sponsorships. He didn't do that. And we really don't know if he would have been a color commentator or what life would have held for him since he died at Daytona in 2001. We don't know if he was going to be like Jeff Gordon and be up in a booth. We don't know. So that's one of the unknowns with him, is where his life would have went if he hadn't have passed away in 2001.
Gotcha. All right. We've talked about on the track. We've talked about off the track. We've talked about the championships and accomplishments, what their fellow drivers thought of them. All right, what will be the legacy of Dale Earnhardt? Or what is the legacy of Dale Earnhardt?
Yeah. I agree with Darrell Waltrip. They asked him the same question a few years ago. What is the legacy of Dale Sr.? He said safety. He said because of Dale's death, there's been a lot of lives that's been saved. Even before his death, NASCAR had a terrible stretch of deaths on the track. Adam Petty, Kyle Petty's son, Adam, was killed in New Hampshire in 2000, and Kenny Irwin was killed 2 months later on the same track in a test session at New Hampshire. After his death in the final lap of 2001 race at Daytona, before that, NASCAR did not make the Hans device, which protects drivers from whiplash. That was not a mandated device. And there's a scene, it's a really haunting scene in that 3 movie where he and Dale Jr. are having a conversation in front of a campfire before the Daytona 500. And he tells Dale Jr., I want you to wear that device. The Hans device was a newer device that came along. He says, I want you to wear that new device. Dale Sr. didn't wear it because he didn't find it comfortable. He didn't want to wear it. He had his set ways. He had raced for 4 different decades. He never had to wear it. But he wanted his son to wear it because Dale Sr.'s father was one of the leading people in the NASCAR industry in the 50s with safety. There were some bars that he put in his car, and it was revolutionary back then. So was Dale Sr. Dale Sr. saw the future. He saw that the Hans device was going to be something that was going to be used in the future, and he wanted his son to use it. Since NASCAR mandated the use of the Hans device after that wreck, no drivers in all the 3 major series have passed away. There has been no NASCAR deaths in the Truck Series, in the Busch Series, or the main series since 2001. Look at the violent crashes we've had. Look at Ryan Newman. What would Ryan Newman's we have no idea, but the wreck with Dale Sr., it didn't look that bad. And just imagine how these violent wrecks, the cars, they're trying to push him to 200 miles an hour. Just imagine how much harm would have been caused if NASCAR hadn't mandated that. And unfortunately, it took the loss of their number 1 star, number 1 draw to force them to get in the safety business. In addition to the Hans device, the tracks have installed safer barriers at most tracks, including Daytona. That's been a new thing. And even after his death, the car tomorrow, the car they're racing right now, is a prototype that's come out of his death, trying to make the car safer. We don't know how many more races or championships he would have had after, if he hadn't died that day in Daytona. He could have won a championship in 2001. We don't know. That's one of the great ifs in NASCAR, was what trajectory would Dale Sr. have went on if he hadn't died. I can tell you one thing, NASCAR has suffered since he's died in terms of the attendance, in terms of the viewership. That Daytona 500 in 2001 had about 17 million viewers. In 2019, had 9. Had about half as many people watch the Daytona 500. Let's look at Bristol. The night race at Bristol in the 90s was the hardest ticket to get in all of sports, harder than Masters. Right now, the night race at Bristol, they're begging people to come. They're putting tarps over the top of the stadium. People, for better or for worse, it may not be just because Dale Sr. passed away. It may be that Jeff Gordon has left. It may be that Dale Sr. There's been an exodus of that 90s generation. But I think you can trace it back to when Dale Sr. passed away that day. He had a huge fan base. And that fan base went to his son, Dale Jr. Once Dale Jr.'s left, that fan base is maybe Austin Dillon, it's fragmented now. That fan base, there's nobody to coalesce around anymore. Earnhardt was named one of ESPN's 20 greatest drivers. They also named him the greatest driver of all time in 2007. Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. If you look at the racing teams, if you look at Petty Enterprises and Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated won 106 times across the 3 major circuits, won 6 championships. Most of those were in the Busch Series. But his racing team, even though he never raced for him, was much more successful than Petty Enterprises. So I think the legacy of Dale Earnhardt will be the Intimidator. It will be the iconic number 3, that logo that is the most famous logo in all of NASCAR, that black 3. or the white 3 with the black around it will be the most famous logo forever. He will be the best competitor in the history of the sport.
Isn't it? Richard Petty's legacy. What will it be?
Well, at 83 years young, Richard Petty is still the king of the road, or should I say the king of the racetrack. You may not know a lot about baseball, but you know who Babe Ruth is. Same with basketball. You might not know a whole lot about the sport, but you know who Michael Jordan is. And it's the same way with NASCAR. You might not know every rule or every stat or everything about NASCAR, but you know who Richard Petty is. I'd say that his legacy is that of longevity and evolution. He has a racing career that spans from the late 50s into the early 90s. And he can still be spotted on race day even in 2020 with that signature cowboy hat and sunglasses that he always has. Like I talked about earlier, 1,184 starts, 500 consecutive from 71 through 89. And even look at the Petty family. You had his dad, Lee Petty. Then you had Richard Petty. You had his son, Kyle Petty. And then you have Austin Petty and Adam Petty, who tragically passed away in 2000 on a practice session. Another thing, other than his longevity, is his evolution and what he did for NASCAR. Richard Petty raced several different cars. And I'm not talking about going from a Chevy Monte Carlo to a Chevy Impala or something like that. Richard Petty raced Ford. He raced Chevrolet. He raced Dodge. He raced Plymouth. He raced Oldsmobile, Buick, and Pontiac. 7 different cars he would re-race. He also represents that transition of NASCAR from where it was just a southern sport, you know, with the dirt tracks, into what it's grown to today as a huge worldwide international sport. Even if it's not as popular as it was in the 90s, you see that evolution, and Richard Petty was right there with that evolution. And as the sport changed, Richard Petty evolved, and he still won. You know, he also, talking about winning, he won under different point systems, which is also a testament to his ability to evolve with the sport. I know I've talked about this, seems like every 10 minutes, but Richard Petty did claim that he's not retired. He just simply quit racing. So we don't know what the future will hold for Richard Petty. I wouldn't count the man out. That we don't know about, but what we do know is we will never, ever have another one like Richard Petty.
Absolutely. All right, guys, I've got 2 follow-ups for each of you. And for the sake of time, I'm limiting you to 30 seconds on your response. So I will start with you, Bennett. In trying to decipher these 2, there's those 80 from 79 to 92 where they're in the same field against the same competition. Tell me about Richard Petty's competition pre-1979 as far as the talent of the other drivers.
I think it's like I talked about earlier, especially in the 60s, of all the guys. I'm not going to rename them again, but as you saw, they were all Hall of Famers that he raced against, and they were racing 2 or 3 times a week. And the fact that he was able to best them more times than not, I think is a testament to the competition that he had pre-Dale Earnhardt.
Elrod, in a similar vein, tell me about Earnhardt's competition post-1992.
Post-1992. Well, Bill Elliott was still around during that time. He was formidable. Rusty Wallace. I mean, some people will make this argument that Jeff Gordon is one of the 3 best drivers of all time. He's got to compete against Jeff Gordon during this time. Dale Jarrett, the Labonte brothers. Who else? Mark Martin. So the problem, or the thing about Dale Senior during the 90s is he's having to race against 35 to 40 guys. I mean, even though he may be better than some of these guys, they have the ability to wreck him. I mean, this is a much larger field. He's still the quality of the driver in the late 90s, I would argue, is better than the quality in the 60s and 70s. Jeff Gordon, like I said, Dale Jarrett, Bill Elliott, Rusty Wallace, Mark Martin, the Labonte brothers speak for themselves.
Nobody has ever ranked Terry Labonte as top competition. Bobby, I liked Bobby. Terry was
I was a champion.
Terry was kind of a douche. Elrod, this one's for you. Again, try to keep it 30 seconds or so. But I've got a little bit of a long intro into the question. So, Dale Earnhardt, one of the most polarizing when he was driving drivers there. You said it was either Earnhardt or Gordon, and you couldn't like both. You liked one. Really, it was Earnhardt or anybody else.
Yeah.
You were an Earnhardt fan or you hated Earnhardt. Now, I grew up in a family. In the 90s, I was a Rusty Wallace guy. My mom and my brother were Jeff Gordon guys. One thing we all agreed on, we hated Dale Earnhardt. Now, that being said, tragic ending, Daytona 500, 2001. He goes down in history. Everybody remembers. I can tell you exactly where I was. I wasn't watching that race, but I can tell you exactly where I was when I heard. And we have talked on this show before about musicians and things that one of the best things for their career was they died. Since the fact that he was so polarizing and now seems universally so loved, do you think because of the way he went out has helped his image? Or do you think that at the end of the day when he retired, people would have respected him then? Because there were a lot of people before Daytona in 2001 that hated him. Nobody was happy he died, but they hated Dale Earnhardt.
Yeah. I mean, everybody hates a winner. That's the reason most people hate the Yankees. They hate a winner. I'll say this. When I was in elementary school, a television was wheeled into our classroom twice during the school day to watch an event. The first one was not, or the later one was 9/11. But before that, it was the funeral for Dale Earnhardt. He had him dying. I think death does things to people where it makes them like someone that they hate. But we don't know where Dale Earnhardt would have wound up. Like I said, he was on track to maybe win the championship in 2001. He would have accumulated, he would have been more hated then because everybody hates a winner. So we really don't know where he would have ended up in total wins and total championships. But like I said, death has a way of distorting people's views about people. So I don't really know. I do know that everybody hates a winner. I think that's the reason why most people hated Earnhardt, and maybe his driving style too, because he would rack their favorite driver out of the race. I can just hear the chorus of boos in Bristol in '99 when all the Terry Labonte fans and everybody else, the Gordon fans, were mad because he put Labonte in the wall. I mean, he was a polarizing figure, but death has a way of reshuffling people's feelings toward people.
Minute for you on a lighter note. Elrod's kind of alluded to this without just coming out and saying it, although that may be the crux of his closing arguments. But there is the argument that Richard Petty raced so many more races than everybody else. Of course, he had more wins. The more you race, the more likely you are to have those wins. 200 wins is a lot of wins. Do you think the fact that he got to race so much, so often, do you think that dampens his legacy, kind of dilutes it, or do you think that helps it?
I don't think that it really should dampen it. I'm going to go back to a baseball analogy again. It's different eras. Like I said, he couldn't control how many races they had during the season. He just went out there and raced, and it got the job done. Look at baseball back in the day where pitchers, were pitching way more than they do now. It's just the way that it was. But that doesn't take away from the fact if the pitcher struck out 30 in a game or whatever, maybe not 30, but talking about how many strikeouts they have and stuff like that. It's just because they did it more back then, but that's how it was. It shouldn't take away from. We still look at some of the older guys like Christy Mathewson, even Babe Ruth, that was a pitcher. That we still hold them in a high regard, even though it's a completely different era than like your Greg Maddoxes and your Pedro Martinez's. You take it for what it is, and you don't need to compare an era with another era.
It's a good thing we don't compare pitchers today to Cy Young's 511 wins. Because I don't know when's the last time a pitcher started 511 games, Cy Young. But anyway, all right, gentlemen. I'm going to be honest. It's close. When we decided we were going to do this topic, I was leaning one way. I did a little research. I leaned the other way. I did a little more research. I started leaning back the original way. I've heard your arguments up to this point, and I'll put it like this. It's neck and neck coming out of turn 4. The last push towards the checkered flag is here, and it's now. Will Richard Petty dash to the front, as he was known to do? Or is Earnhardt about to push him into the wall, as he's known to do? Closing arguments. Bennett, you're up.
All right, I'll make this quick. Richard Petty's entire career has involved motorsports, literally, ever since he was born, even being, like I said, the crew chief at 12. He has numerous records that, whether it's fair or not, they will not be broken. He's going to go down in history in the record books with these records that people aren't going to touch. 200 wins, first to 7 championships, won NASCAR's biggest race 7 times, which is a record. He won at 51 different racetracks. He holds the record for the most wins in a season, 27. That would be like somebody winning every single race in a season. But he did win 10 of those in a row. So that is the equivalent of somebody winning, a third of every race, which would be crazy. Could you imagine somebody winning a third of every race? He had over 700 top 10 finishes, 356 top 5 finishes, a record 127 poles. He's in the inaugural Hall of Fame class, which I think was 2010. He was also voted most popular driver 9 times. He also did a whole lot, and he still does a whole lot of charity work that I didn't even get to talk about tonight. He's motorsport royalty, and he's really like a gift that I think we kind of take for granted in the NASCAR world. And Elrod, you talked a little bit about safety. You know that little net that's beside the driver there, the window? You know who invented that? Richard Petty. He had an injury to his arm and his shoulder that he kept from people, but he's like, man, I need to find some way to protect. You can't do glasses too heavy. So he came up with this idea for this netting to be right here to kind of protect your side there. He said he was a rookie of the year in 59. He's got that charismatic presence. He's a total class, total generous guy. Here's another rep point for you too. From 1974, he drove a Dodge Charger. I know it's not the 69, but he still rocked the Charger. And that's one of the more iconic cars, if you think about that Dodge Charger that he wore with that blue and red paint scheme. No one is more decorated, and I would venture to say that no one has made more of an impact. Maybe they've made as much of an impact to the sport, but not more of an impact. I know we talk about his inflated wins. You know, he had 200 wins. He raced so much longer. They did so many more races back then. But let's look at that. Richard Petty raced 35 years. His last win was 1984. So if you take off his last 8 years, you come up with 27 years. Dale Earnhardt also, his career raced 27 years. So even taking away those 8 years where he didn't win, he still has those 200 wins. He still has the 7 championships. He still has all that other stuff. Rut, I'm going to leave you with this to kind of put those 200 wins into perspective. Jeff Gordon, considered one of the best, 93 wins. Dale Earnhardt, a guy we talked about tonight, also one of the best, 76 wins. Kurt Busch, I know what we think about Kurt Busch, but he has 31 wins. If you take those 3 guys' careers and add them up, you get 200 wins. So, Rut, tonight, you could go with the number 3. You could go with Dale Earnhardt. That'd be fair. You know, everyone's made some good points. Earnhardt's got a huge fan base, as we've seen by the comments on our teaser for tonight's episode. He's one of the all-time greats. He's a heck of a driver, and I respect the man. But after I've done all my research, to me at least, he doesn't quite match up to what Richard Petty's accomplished. Besides all the records and all the stats, what Richard Petty has done and what he means to NASCAR, I think will be unmatched. His whole life has been dedicated to racing, and there's no one that's done more for the sport than Richard Petty. So tonight, Rudd, I ask you to go with the king.
All right.
You know, Bennett, if you cut off Petty with his last win in '84, for that entire decade of the 60s to 70s, he's running 60 starts on average a season, 30 more than the average than there is today. So of course he's going to have more wins overall. But let's back this up a little bit. Let's talk about stock car racing. We hear this term a lot, but what does that really mean? Stock car racing was designed for NASCAR cars to be the same as they are in the showcase at a dealership. We know that's not the case. It started changing with Richard Petty, and it started with his 426 Hemi engine that was above and beyond anybody's engine in the 60s. It got so bad in terms of his car being so much better than everybody else that NASCAR banned the 426 Hemi for a period because it was not a production option. So Richard Petty ruined stock car racing, if you want to get down to it, in terms of what we consider stock cars, because it's not what regular people can get. This is something that's only exclusive to NASCAR. So the Petty crowd always says, well, Dale Earnhardt's not running real stock cars, but who really killed the idea of the stock car was Richard Petty. If you're running a car in the 60s and your car is leagues and bounds above everybody else and you have a 20-person field, there's only 4 or 5 people that have a legitimate shot at winning that race. And when you're racing 3 times a week, you're going to come out with 2 or 3. You're going to have 1 or 2 victories a week just because if you play the odds. If you put Earnhardt in that 43 car in the 60s and 70s, his win total is going to at least double, if not triple, with the equipment that he had. Stock cars in the 90s, some teams had better engines. Childers cars had better engines than the Wood brothers, and they still today. But there's parity. There's standards. In the 60s and 70s, you didn't have these standards about the engines and the different parts of the car. If you had more money, your team is going to win a heck of a lot more races. Now, that's still true today to some extent. If you're a better fun company, you're going to have a better shot to win. But back then, there's only 4 or 5 guys that had a legitimate shot to win week in, week out. Earnhardt he won his championships, the same number of championships, and he had parity among these vehicles. You had to be the better driver. You couldn't let the car. You had to do it yourself. Some of Petty's wins, some of these 200 wins that he has, the length of the race was 100 miles. 100 miles was the length of some of these victories. Let's look at Daytona, which was Richard Petty's bread and butter. He's won 7 times. He raced at Daytona a total of 74 times in his career. Dale Earnhardt Sr. raced 46. 37 to 34. Richard Petty has over 28 more starts at Daytona, but only 3 more top 10s than Dale Sr. Even though he doesn't have the wins at Daytona, at least the 500 that Petty has, he owned, for the most part, every aspect of the Daytona International Speedway. Petty, let's go back to the wins real quick. He won 3 times in 1 week. He won 5 races in 17 days. 17 days. The thing about racing back in the 60s that we're talking about, a lot of the cars didn't finish the race just because a big portion of the cars that were entering into these races back then were not very good. They did not meet this. They didn't have a Pearson level car. They didn't have a Petty level car. They were just kind of junkers. So he was racing at the end of the race with maybe 5 to 10 vehicles on the track. Of course, he's going to have a better shot to win these races. And then finally, I'll leave this point with you right here. Richard Petty had an 8-year win drought toward the later part of his career. Let's talk about Daytona one more time. If you're going to sit here and say that the measure of Daytona 500s is your measure of whether you're a good driver or not, are we sitting here saying that Michael Waltrip is better than Tony Stewart? Michael Waltrip has 2. Tony Stewart has 0. Smoke is such a better driver overall than Michael Waltrip is. He was his entire career. He just didn't have the wins to show for it on the 500. Petty's a legend. But when you look at stats, when you look at the level of competition, when you look at the car that he had to be inside of, it all points to 3, the Intimidator. And I have now convinced you, right, that the Intimidator is better than the King.
Are we going back to Brad Johnson versus Marino?
No.
That's what that sounded like. Gentlemen.
Dale Earnhardt drove for Good Ranch, the biggest company on the planet. Do you think he might have had an advantage as well?
Yeah, but his car was never banned. I mean, his car was so good in the 60s, NASCAR banned it because he said, you're killing the competition. Your engine's too good. He was never banned. There was some parity in the 90s with Hendrick, with Roush. There were other teams that had the same caliber of engines, but not in the 60s. There was 3 or 4 drivers that had a legitimate shot of winning those races each week.
And that's the evolution, though. That's how it was.
That's how it was.
And he still got it done. A win is a win, regardless. He could have raced 1,000 times, but if you're a crappy driver, you're still not going to win.
Well, Petty was aging in the 80s, but when you look at, he had to start racing in other cars that had the same level of engine, the same parity. He didn't win a race for 8 years toward the end of his career. So,
What about that modern era when they did go down to 28 or 30? He won 58 races in a span of 4 years, from 71 to I think 75, and 5 championships in that time. So that's
Earnhardt won 7 in the modern era.
in 27 years. He won 3 of Daytonas out of 4 years in that modern era where he didn't race 60 times.
In between 75 and 92, Petty won 15 races. Earnhardt won 52. That's what I'll say about that. In the modern era, from 75, when Earnhardt first started racing, 52. In terms of their head-to-head, 52 to 15.
Yeah, because he's on his decline. Everybody has a decline. That's like saying, Greg Oden's better than Michael Jordan because he outscored him that night. Because Michael Jordan's 100 years old by then. The talent is going to go down a little bit against these young, fresh guys coming out.
Well, toward the end of his career, like I said, in 2001, Dale Singer's is approaching 50, and he still has a legitimate shot to win a championship. He could have easily won in 2001. He should have won in 2000 if it wasn't for Bobby Labonte and a couple snafus. He could have won in 2000. He could have won in 2001 too. So he was still on the trajectory to pass him, if not for his death in 2001.
Could have, but we'll never know. So we can't say that he could have. We'll never know.
I'm surprised that Petty didn't win more championships. He won 200 races. You think he'd have won more than 7 championships? Earnhardt won 76 races. He won the same amount of championships as Petty did. You think he would win more?
I don't know. You think somebody would win more than once at Daytona in 27 years?
Better than winning 0.
True. Okay, sure. Let's wrap this up. This is going for a long time.
You two are having a me and Elrod type argument, and I am enjoying this, to be completely honest. But while you all were doing that, I looked at the photo. I looked at the photo for the photo finish. And let's break down what I just saw. First of all, Bennett loses a point. He didn't get a Forrest Gump reference in this week. But Bennett is winning on rut points by 2 or 3 to 1. So, I mean, that in and of itself. Both of these guys are legends. The fact of everything Dale Earnhardt's done, he gets all the credit for the safety of NASCAR now. Granted, I don't think that was his aim, but without Dale Earnhardt and the way that he died in Daytona at 2001, if it wasn't for that, we would have lost Ryan Newman at Daytona in 2020. I'm completely convinced. That contribution, although not intentional, his life has literally saved other lives, and that can't be overlooked. He was, I'm going to go throw in wrestling terms because that's what I do. The 90s, that term cool heel became a thing where people liked to cheer the bad guy, so to speak. Dale Earnhardt was the bad guy. If you weren't a Dale Earnhardt fan, you hated Dale Earnhardt. But people loved the bad guy in the 90s. Therefore, he had a huge fan base that still lives today, long after he's been gone. Raise hell, praise Dale. Those guys are out in full force all over our Facebook and Instagram accounts. Some of them have been very vulgar, and I've had to delete their comments. But, you know, that is what it is. This is a family show. Elrod, you know your microphone's muted? Did you do that?
Oh, there you go.
I got you. Anyway, what Dale Earnhardt meant to the sport cannot never be taken away. When we look at the King, when we look at Richard Petty, you may say, oh, he raced all these races, no wonder he has all these wins. And maybe there's some validity to that argument. But the way I look at it, have you ever gone on a long car ride? How tired you are afterwards? How sick of sitting in a car you are? Yet he's racing 3 times a week for how many years? At hundreds of miles a race, not to mention having to travel to the next town, as Petty Enterprises did when they first started. There was no flying the cars in. They were driving the cars there. So to me, the fact that he did that for so long and raced for so long says a whole lot about longevity that I don't think anybody else can ever or will ever say, because nowadays they don't have to. Elrod, you bring up that the Hemi engine got banned. It did. But you know what? Until it got banned, it was it wasn't illegal. Now, granted, after he did it, they made it illegal. But before that ban, you know how many of those championships he won? One. All the other ones came after that ban when he's on more of a level playing field. But he did have the drop off there at the end because he'd been racing for 20 years, all that time. Sure, he got tired of doing it. Both of them huge names, both of them lasting impacts. My deciding factor tonight is this. A lot of times when we prepare for this show, whether I'm mediating or whether I'm arguing, if it's something I can look up, I will, and I look at polls. I look at what people think, what experts think. I look at fan polls, all sorts of things. And I looked in preparation for this show at several lists of experts of who's the best driver. Who is the best driver in NASCAR history? And almost every single one of those lists, number one and number two were Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt. Some of them had one as one, some of them had the others one. But I want to look at the names I saw, the consensus. There are about 7 guys that were consensus in those lists. Those two. Then you've got Jimmy Johnson, who also has 7 championships, who didn't race against either one of these guys. So he's out. Jeff Gordon's up there. So that goes to Earnhardt's competition. But when you look at the rest of the names on the list, David Pearson, Bobby Allison, Junior Johnson. Some lists have Cale Yarborough, but Yarborough was still racing in Earnhardt's years, so I don't really count that against him. But 200 wins against David Pearson, Bobby Allison, Junior Johnson, by nose. Even when you look at the level of competition, and I lean towards Richard Petty. And then Bennett tells me that the man signed a duck. And that signed, sealed, and delivered. Sorry to run you into the wall, Elrod, but Bennett.
That's okay. Kenny Wallace agrees with me. That's all.
Here's the thing. Kenny, how have we gone this whole show? Kenny Wallace, you are the freaking man. I wanted to say that at the beginning. Because, listen, you guys think, they did it on Cameo. They just paid them money and they said something for them. Which, when we started this, that's what we thought. But, guys, we've had a lot of trouble with Cameo. And that's why every day Mick Foley is becoming more of a favorite. And Kenny Wallace is becoming more of a favorite on my list. Because he is the freaking man. But, anyway, here's my thing. Dale Earnhardt doesn't die in 2001. This is a completely different conversation. I think Earnhardt goes on to win 8, maybe 9, maybe 10 championships. And I'm apologizing to Bennett right now. But something beyond his control kept him from doing. It was beyond Richard Petty's control that they were racing 60 races in the 60s. It was beyond Dale Earnhardt's control that he didn't get to race past 2001. But I can only judge on what we're given. And what we're given by the slimmest of noses, Bennett, you've convinced me.
Dadgum Sterling Marlin. He screwed this all up for me.
Are we saying that the duck won this? Are we saying that?
Here's the thing. You won by this much. Without the duck, you would have won by this much.
The duck.
You won by a little more than a duck's bill.
If anybody knows about this duck, please message us.
Let us know.
This is payback for last week. I know it is.
No, you didn't. I should be paying Bennett back for last week. He's the one that gave you the win. If I was seeking payback, I would have pissed on Bennett.
Maybe if I go on 10 other shows tonight, and maybe I can win 4 or 5 of them and claim wins just like Petty did.
But it won't be as against such good competition. So, Bennett, Elrod, gentlemen, any parting words?
Well, I don't know if I've ever said this before, but I think tonight's been one of my favorite episodes. No, and in all honesty, of course, I'm a big Dale Jr. fan, but after doing this research and everything, I think my number 2 now is probably Richard Petty. I think so.
Here's another point I want to point in there, and this is not good, bad, or indifferent. Has no bearing on them as a driver at all. But half of NASCAR fans, or nearly half, because he had about half the fan base that loved him. The other half, he had the biggest fan base because the other half were split up among the other 40 drivers. But all those other all that other half hated him. Everybody loves Richard Petty. You said everybody hates winners. Nobody hates Richard Petty. Again, that has no bearing on him as a driver, but just another point. All right. Much like me last week, I'm going to show you, unlike you did, I'm going to show you some sympathy. Are you okay?
No. Daggum Sterling Marlin had to ruin it for everybody. Had to take him out on the last lap of the 500.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding. I love Sterling.
Bad deal.
DW was excited. Not
Silver Bullet.
By the
Silver
way,
Bullet.
speaking of DW, Darrell Waltrip is by far my favorite driver whose groceries I've bagged.
I remember that.
I worked at Kroger when I was in college, and some guy the guy I worked with came up to me and said, "You're a NASCAR fan, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Darrell Waltrip's back there at the eggs." And I intentionally bagged his groceries. And I said, "Mr. Waltrip, I'm a big fan. Can I carry your groceries to your car for you?" And he said, "Well, I ain't that old, but I appreciate it." That's my DW story. But anyway, guys, thanks for hanging with us. This has been fun. We'll be back next week. Not sure what we're doing, but we'll know by then. Again, the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Go like us on all of them. Subscribe to the podcast, rate the podcast, review the podcast. Most importantly, for this podcast to grow, listen to the podcast. Even for just a few minutes. Listen to my sweet anchor ad at the beginning of it. And you don't have to listen to all this again, but it still counts as a listen towards us. We can get sponsorships. We can make the show even better. If you want to support us directly, anchor.fm /convince me show. Hit the listener support button. But with that being said, Casey Elrod for Brian Bennett, I'm Andy Rutherford. Bennett, you have convinced me. We'll see who's convincing next week. Peace.